Is it masochistic for someone to find a number of sites completely unimpressive and downright obnoxious and insulting to their intelligence, the contents of the sites, contributions by those sites' users? Is it masochistic to have that kind of a reaction to a number of sites, but to then keep frequenting the sites? And by someone, I'm referring to myself, because this is what I keep doing, this site being chief among them, YouTube. And it's not just that I'm annoyed with the sort of interactions I have with users, but worst of all is these comments, comment replies. Someone says something stupid, every now and then I'll feel tempted to respond to it. Incisive breakdown, line by line breakdown of what they say, and despite that, you see your comment posted from your own channel, then you log out of your channel, and you find that your comment went poof. Happens increasingly. So just sort of adds insult to injury, the brain injury of even dealing with people on this site. But then it's just, on top of that, they won't even see it. So then you try to post it from a different channel, so then you gotta check once you sign out of that channel, and it's just so much work. And whatever little therapeutic value you may get out of it, it's taken away increasingly month after month. Now that these comments get shadow banned, or I guess the channel is shadow banned. I don't know what's going on. I just know that more and more frequently, I get nothing out of decisive breakdowns and replies to people in text. So, is that masochism to keep coming back? Well, maybe not, because maybe it doesn't really matter whether those comments are displayed in public. Maybe just the process itself, as much as I don't want to admit it to myself, the process of composing a reply to really dumb comments, maybe that process is rewarding enough, such that I justify to myself ever logging back into YouTube, much less uploading a video. Maybe. I've always thought that it was actually them seeing the comment and potentially not even being convinced, but just changing how they think, changing how they perceive the opposing view based on how I present the opposing view. And I don't even have to hold the opposing view. That's such a major problem, increasingly so. I'm not sympathetic to most of the conclusions that people criticize. I am sympathetic to the fact that they butcher the conclusions. So it's the process that I'm sympathetic toward, whatever position, whose conclusion I'm defending. The process of how their proponents get there gets butchered by their opponents, every which way. And I'm so fed up with it. And so, yeah, I'll put in the effort, but then it's for nothing because, well, I'm shadow banned or whatever it is. Whatever it is. And it's masochistic, probably. But then again, maybe on a subconscious level, not so much, because it does instill a superiority complex. See, I have this bouncy superiority-inferiority complex. I spend half my time reading scholarly papers, fantastic papers, truly going to the next level when it comes to a lot of issues in analytic philosophy, and mind-blowing, damn near. And then the moment I get off of those scholarly papers and consult what is posted on 95% of the internet I frequent, it's like, gone is the inferiority complex from reading those scholarly papers, and instilled is superiority complex based on reading what people do generally. And it can be just within a span of minutes. I can go from, I really need to improve such that I can make a contribution that's on par with this great paper, 600-page paper, to just thinking that I've gone to too much lengths as it is, given the quality of the average comment. So I'm trying to figure that out. That's one of the things I'm trying to figure out. This will probably be a rapid-fire themed video. I'm probably going to bounce back from theme to theme. Let's talk about, well, no, let's not talk about. Let's briefly mention the catastrophe that is the 2020 Democratic candidates, and notably the commentary surrounding them, because it's been a long time since I've thought positively about the Democratic base, whether if I ever thought fully positively about the base, but the reaction to Marianne Williamson, and it's time after time I scroll to the comments and I see positive remarks. people truly think that she is approaching, she's getting to the root. Even Bill Maher said it. She's getting to the root of the issues in the way she talks. And she's bringing something fresh and unique, and it just demonstrates her shallowness and inability, and referring to wonkishness as something that's negative and something that we have to actually get over in these discussions, when actually we need far more of it, right? All that symbolic gesturing on her part, people mistaking that for insight. Like all you're doing is showing me that your level of understanding is superficial as fuck when you mistake that for insight. And then there's all her specific stuff. She is wooey. She is just crystallizes, Jesus, Freudian slip. Just everything bad about the fact that she can even get a blip on the radar, much less make it as far as she has on that stage. And crowding out a guy like Andrew Yang. Andrew Yang, not without his faults, of course, despite UBI being one of the main policy proposals that I would back. He wants to go a step further and reward traditionally non-economic type activities, because he wants to say raising children is some of the greatest things you can do from an economic standpoint, because it flatters the future generations. And there's so many ways that this future generation stuff comes apart. Let me read a comment that I left on my community, because I nail it. I start talking about how inconsistent in terms of priorities people are on a lot of this stuff. Because if you're going to say the far future matters, or even the not so far future, then you're going to have to be consistent enough in terms of how much time you're willing to spend on the most important policies combating climate change and eco-responsibility and all this stuff. And you should just say it flat out. This has to take up the overwhelming majority of our time, especially if the 12-year prediction, if you genuinely believe that, and people talk as if they are utterly convinced that we've got 12 years left before the irreversibility effect kicks in, right? So you care about the far future. You don't just care about people who actually exist right now and how their lives go. You care about something beyond that, and you want to combat climate change primarily on those grounds, but you say we only have 12 years left and it's a really tall task, and then you're also willing to talk about devote the majority of your time to non-climate related issues. Well, let me just read my comment, because I just pretty much distill it in this comment. So I write, climatologists and ecologists correctly predict, and I'm being facetious when I say correctly predict that the eco-doomsday clock gives our statesmen / ourselves 12 short years to get our collective act together, and that if we don't, the planet becomes irrecoverably doomed. Picture yourself believing this, being utterly convinced of it, in fact. And then spending the majority of your argumentative, polemical, or otherwise dialectical time plus energy on totally different agendas, all of which you understand as having no direct impact on climate and eco-responsibility, and most of which, at minimum 70 to 80% based on my estimates, you understand as having no direct or indirect impact on climate and eco-responsibility. So then I give an example of a no direct impact with a somewhat possibility of indirect bearing on climate change, and I cite the example of people praising minimalism and spirituality and wanting to pass on that sort of message. And just like any other message, that message will crowd out climate change, but I guess you can make some sort of an argument that it will indirectly flatter agendas which want to combat climate change. But that's a small share of people's agendas, based on what I can see, and I think I've got my finger on the pulse. Because, again, I don't spend nearly as much time reading scholarly papers. I spend too much time in the fucking gutter that is 95% of the internet. So I got my finger on the pulse. And then I give a no indirect impact on climate change example, without any possibility of it bearing on climate change and reversing climate change. And I cite something like, oh, concerns over not enough women in STEM. So you got 12 years left. And they believe it with utter conviction. They are devoutly convinced that it's 12 years left, because they found enough climatologists who will report that that is the case, who will agree that action needs to be taken urgently. But then all this other time, and they call, and they would refer to me as committing the fallacy of relative privation. So how near, well, what if we sliced that in half? What if instead of 12 years it was 6 years? At what point are you going to say something is too urgent such that it can crowd out all the other agendas, to the extent that you're going to rank it as a top priority? The word like the way they use the fallacy of relative privation, ranking priorities itself should be unacceptable. Because at some point, if there is enough of a gap between priority A and priority B, your behavior ought to reflect that. Why is that so difficult for people to accept? And to the extent that it doesn't reflect that, maybe there's something else going on. Maybe you don't value the far future in the ways you think you do. Well, that's the concluding bit of my comment, which I spoiled, but I'll read it out anyway. So yeah, not enough women in STEM is my example. So something we should spend time talking about and correcting for. And so then I write, if that weren't incoherent enough, imagine gleefully, non-reluctantly, endorsing candidates and statespersons whose agenda set and behavior mirrors that warped approach to priority that doesn't temporally adjust to what you say those priorities are, in terms of how much time you spend on issues. So then I conclude, I say, in American politics, there's an aphorism along the lines of, Americans are fiscally conservative on an ideological level and fiscally liberal / permissive on an operational level. It's long been a sort of truism of many Americans, I would say the majority. And then I write, I've concluded that this discordance rings far truer when something else is at stake, once you examine people's stated versus revealed priorities concerning the far future. People are ideologically mortified at the prospect of their generation or their children's generations being among the last, while being operationally at ease with highly immoderate versions of the person affecting restriction. I don't define the person affecting restriction, but I leave a link to where the Stanford Encyclopedia article goes into it in all of its versions at length. It's basically saying adding new people to the world does not improve the world. It doesn't go further than that. And even that strikes a lot of people, a lot of ethicists who do the population ethics thing. It strikes them as highly counterintuitive. But that's the person affecting restriction. Where was I? Let's see. All that's needed to spot this sneaky reorientation is for levels of future concern to be categorized appropriately and measured quantitatively. If this is allowed, you would expect for most political projects to ideologically intermingle themselves with some aspect of impersonal population ethics. So population ethics that does not discriminate based on temporal or modal features. Doesn't matter how far off the far future is. If it's trillion years away, that sort of potential persons are every bit as relevant as actual persons right now, to the extent that they can be turned from potential to actual. Impersonal population ethics. Operationally, this has never been the case, and successfully convincing a large share of the electorate that humanity has only 12 years left in which to make massive corrections hasn't changed a damn thing. You could slice the timeline in half, and the convinced majority would still be operationally person-affecting, and rightly so. It's profoundly unethical to prioritize interests differently. So that very same, which most, by my count, most political theorists accept in America, that there's this ideological operational split, that is very much applicable, I believe, when you try to combine this issue of climate change and when from a time management perspective, you try to get people to act in accordance to what they themselves state are their convictions about just how close the doomsday is. It shows there's just a gap between the stated belief and the revealed belief. Or pro-nay attitudes, however you want to put it. Whatever you think this can be categorized as. Maybe it's more affect than cognition, but that's a whole different can of worms that I don't want to get into right now. So that's one comment I left, and I forgot how I got into that tangent in the first place. I got into that tangent because that's what Andrew Yang, I was going to pick a bone with Andrew Yang, which I like a lot of his stuff. It's actually the only, other than Sanders, whose policy proposals is pretty much a mirror image of what it was in 2016. Very few changes. Other than Sanders, I just checked up on Andrew Yang's comprehensive policies, and a lot of them are good, but there is this stuff about rewarding parenthood economically. And so that assumes what it assumes. It assumes that the most important thing is to create a far future that's anything but lifeless. Right? Lifeless is worst case scenario. And if it's anything other than that, as I would propose, it's a lot of things, but that is not it in terms of the highest priority, then that aspect of Andrew Yang's reward mechanism for a future economy, raising children, that has to go. But overall, I wouldn't pick too many bones with Andrew Yang. There's something about the way he communicates, and I know there's a silly saying about how American voters want someone who doesn't talk like a politician. But then they make another mistake by saying they want someone that they feel that they can have a beer with. Right? So they don't say, I don't want a politician, I want someone who talks like a Bayesian rationalist. No. They want someone who can have a beer with, or someone who's anti-PC, which can be done very easily from numerous angles. Beer with, George W. Bush example. Yeah, okay. Didn't go over too well. Someone who's PC or anti-PC, well, where the fuck do you start? Do I want to turn this into a political incorrectness rant? Do I want to do that? Because I still see, there was a video I made in 2016 talking about how most people don't give a fuck about self-censorship unless it's in a particular context. Most people are okay with self-censorship. They will prioritize it, the elimination of it, below other things like the value of hard work under employment schemes, and that value having intrinsic sort of value in and of itself. Because most of the self-censorship that takes place when you clock in, and it stops once you clock out. So there's got to be a trade-off here between the two, and that ties into UBI as well. But about Yang. See, he doesn't talk like a politician, but he also doesn't talk like someone you feel like you can have a beer with. He talks like the sort of person, the sort of people that I am impressed with in that small corner of the internet, that 5% corner of the internet, the scholarly papers corner, the Scott Alexander forum corner. He really does bring rationalism as close as possible to the American mainstream scene. And he's not going to go far, but at least it's something. At least he's visible. And then you got stupid woo peddlers like Marianne Williamson crowding him out. And why is that? Like, why isn't anyone making the criticism that if there's, however, what, 20, 24? 24 of them, just by the fact that there's that many, it's going to water down. You can have every single one of them give the optimal presentation during the debates, in between debates, whenever. Just the fact that there's that many of them will make them seem like they are regurgitating things, because there's only so many differences. And once you hear the message, it can be a fantastic message from an optics standpoint. When you hear that many people saying more or less the same thing, it just starts to sound like babble. It's awful optics. And that's the first order of business. The first order of business, if we're going to revamp this whole process, no more than 8. No more than 8. Now, whether that's something networks can agree among themselves, we will cover no more than 8. Or whether that should just be a cold hard rule, that's neither here nor there for my purposes. I'm just saying, from a branding standpoint, you got 24 of them, I don't care how much quality they pack on a substantive level. It's going to sound like, it's just going to sound like a drabby ordeal. But also, let's not forget that climate change is not a winner on an electoral level. It's just not. It's probably worth a mention, if I'm going to go about it at length. I should probably throw in the fact that here are the top issues for Americans, rated as, what are they rated as very big problem type issues. And I'll insert the graphic in the corner and I'll link to it so you can read the whole study itself, but just a snapshot of what the study says. So 70% of Americans who were polled rated drug addiction as a very big problem. Below that was affordability of healthcare at 67%, tied at 67% ethics in government, affordability of education at 63%, the ability of Democrats and Republicans to work together at 62%, the role of lobbyists and special interest groups in Washington, 53%, the way the political system operates, 52%. God, that doesn't leave a lot to the imagination as to what particular feature of the system you have bones to pick with. God, I hate when they make these things so broad. I hate it when so many of the political quizzes I've taken, I think every single one is insufficiently undetailed. That is to say, it's not sufficiently detailed enough when it asks me for my chain of reasoning that leads me to conclude whatever answer I pick. Right? It's just the answer. That's all they register. How is that the most important thing? And like, why do people still take so many of these quizzes seriously when your chain of reasoning is not displayed anywhere? So you end up on the same spot on whatever political map you end up on, along with people whose reasoning has nothing to do with yours, but because your conclusion happens to overlap, you ought to be assigned the same label as them. It's so obnoxious. The way the political system operates, 52%. The gap between rich and poor, 51%. Well, the gap could or may not be entirely a reflection of injustice, so it should just be about, they should frame that always instead of just equality per se. They should talk about whether the equality reflects some sort of injustice and make it very clear, but it's just the gap. Well, there's lots of gaps. Made up news and info, 50% say it's a very big problem. Violent crime, 49%. Climate change, 46%. It's ranking just like in the middle of all these big issues. Actually, no, it's in below the second half. Like drug addiction being at 70%, way above climate change. 70% for drug addiction, 46% for climate change. Just saying. If you want to do the whole cold pragmatist thing, you'll play up drug addiction in case you're interested in your electoral prospects being as high as possible. God, why am I talking to them as if they're watching this? If they are interested in that, they will do so. Americans' level of agreement on basic facts about issues of events, 42%. Americans' level of confidence in the federal government, 41%. See, people are making a big fuss out of this being the top issue when it's actually nowhere near the top issue. That's the other one. Climate change and this other one. Just from a electability standpoint, don't overplay your hand when it comes to issues you think are top tier importance, when it's not going to get you a sympathetic ear from swing voters. And this is not the case when it comes to all elections, but especially when it comes to these swing states. You know, this drug addiction stuff is prominent in these swing states, that it always comes down to these handful of states. Because you're not going to overturn the Electoral College, you might as well stop talking about it. If it does happen, it's going to be a slow-moving process, so you got to zero in on the problems that are prominent in these states, like drug addiction. Where did I stop? Racism at 40%, illegal immigration, 38%. Ooh, illegal immigration. I'm almost at the bottom of the list. The quality of public K-12 schools, 36%. And what's the last one? Terrorism. I got my phone over the screen, so I'm just lowering it. Terrorism, 34%. Sexism, 26%. Americans' level of confidence in each other, 25%. Job opportunities for all Americans, 25%. Yeah, I should figure out some better place to rest my phone than on my laptop screen when I'm recording. All I need to do is just go buy a stand, and I forget every time I'm outside. I forget to just get a proper stand for my phone, so I rest it on my laptop. So that when I'm reading stuff off the screen, I have to maneuver and move the phone. Such sloppiness, even though I do it once in a blue moon, and I still can't get it to be non-sloppy. But yeah, I want to say a few things about immigration, not even illegal immigration, because that's actually not as complex as the questions pertaining to legal immigration, and just how bizarre it is that it's been such a big issue, especially on the internet. I think the internet gives us a skewed picture. It makes it seem like people would rank it as the top issue. It's not the top issue, but it's a pretty fucking big issue in the online discourse sphere. I'd say the last 5 years. It's if you just limit things to online, more ink has been spilled on the subject of immigration simpliciter than I think any other subject, right? So given that that is our setup, I'm going to ask everyone here, of all the prominent commentators who discuss immigration almost as passionately as the sort of mouth-breathy commenters, of all the prestigious, acclaimed commentators, everyone, right, from the bad faith actors to people who are in behind the walls of academia, all the public figures, right, who discuss immigration, how many of them do you actually know in terms of just their quantitative beliefs in terms of the, let's say, the annual influx of legal immigrants? So if you were to say, what is the maximum amount America should accept annually, above which it's too much, and then what is the minimum amount below which it's not enough, right? So you got your maximum and you got your minimum, and then everything in between is something that the commentator would say reasonable people can disagree over, can have debates over. This is open debate season when it comes to everything in between. But they are willing to state, in no uncertain terms, the maximum and the minimum. When it gets to be too much, and when you can't just keep appealing to the fact that there is a Statue of Liberty that says give us your poor, your impoverished, your retarded, your whatnot, you're tired, right? Okay, give us all that, but if it gets to be above this number, this specific number, and no more, right? Then it gets to be too much, and then something below which you will not be willing to compromise. How many of these people who've discussed immigration to death, how many of them do you know what their numbers actually are? If your life depended on it, could you guess? I can't think of a single one, right? To the extent that the candidates have those numbers carved out, well, they may have them carved out on their pages, and like I said, I visited Sanders' page, and I visited Andrew Yang's page, and I didn't walk away remembering what their, to the extent that they even specified it. I forget if they specified it, even on their pages where they lay out their policies. I walked away without remembering it. Now, why is that? It's because they never reference it. They never reference what is the maximum and the minimum annually, the influx. Forget the asylum-seeking subject for the moment. Just table that. And just stick to legal immigration. We should all know, when it comes to these people who are being shoved down our throats or who are genuine grassroots movers and shakers, to the extent that this is a huge issue online, we should all push them to specify, not on some corner of their website, but in just about every interview where immigration comes up. What is the maximum above which it's too unreasonable, the influx is too massive, and then what is the minimum below which you're saying, well, we're being insufficiently empathetic to people who want to immigrate legally. If we go below this minimum number, and then everything in between is something you say, well, let's debate all the stuff in between. Give us the numbers. I can't think of a single one. People talk about immigration all the fucking time, and they don't get asked. This is a major failure on the part of, whatever, the Anderson Cooper types who do these interviews. They don't press for numbers. I think there's a hunger for those specifics over mere platitudes. And even though there's that implicit hunger, the viewers don't demand it. Every single interview on immigration should leave the viewers knowing what the two people, their positions are in terms of those precise numbers. Right? Enough with this gratuitous deportation talk. Enough with this Statue of Liberty is a counter-argument to immigration restrictionism. Enough of all this stuff. Give me your numbers. Please and thank you. And speaking of, I'm just going to read a bit from Wiki, because Wiki has the numbers. So since 1965, and this is just to show why I am not as unsympathetic to what immigration restrictivists are clamoring for, because they have been getting pounded for decades. Their agendas have been losing out for decades, and now they're making some amount of headway, and the pro-immigration crowd are making it out as if this is just the sky's falling. Because after decades of losses, immigration restrictivists are gaining some ground. And then just conflating what is nativism and then portraying it as soft fascism, or some people will just come out and say it's hardline fascism to be a nativist. any non-cosmopolitan political attitude is soft fascism, or in the worst case, the most hyperbolic case, they'll say it's just hardline fascism waiting to come out. It's so fucking ridiculous. It's so infuriating. So since 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, abolished the system of national origin quotas. By equalizing immigration policies, the act resulted in new immigration from non-European nations. Okay, now this is not as interesting. I want numbers. So in 1970, 60% of immigrants were from Europe. This decreased to 15% by 2000. In 1990, George H.W. Bush signed the Immigration Act of 1990, which increased legal immigration to the United States by 40%. Massive win for mass immigrationists, pretending as if they didn't win, forgetting just how recent a massive victory like this has been. And going back to what existed before then, well, was America hardcore nativist before 1990? Because it was only after 1990 that immigration rates spiked by 40%. In 1991, Bush signed the Armed Forces Immigration Adjustment Act 1991, allowing foreign service members who had served, God, this is poorly written, it says who had served 12 or more years in the U.S. Armed Forces to qualify for permanent residency and, in some cases, citizenship. In November 1994, California voters passed Proposition 187, amending the state constitution, denying state financial aid to illegal immigrants. Okay, I guess you can say that's a slight loss in recent history for mass immigration proponents, or illegal immigration proponents in this case. The federal courts voided this change, ruling that it violated the federal constitution. Okay, so maybe not so much. Appointed by Bill Clinton, the U.S. Commission on Immigration Reform recommended reducing legal immigration from about 800,000 people per year to approximately 550,000 people per year. While an influx of new residents from different cultures presents some challenges, quote, "The United States has always been energized by its immigrant population," said President Bill Clinton in 1998. America has constantly drawn strength and spirit from wave after wave of immigrants. Okay, so just in that context right there, so is that soft some evil-ism? Is that a soft evil-ism to propose the Commission on Immigration Reform recommending a restriction from 800,000 annually to 550,000 annually? See, to me, these are totally reasonable restrictions, and I want to know where every candidate stands on those cold hard numbers. And I don't want to have to go down to each and every one of their websites to get that answer. That's the sort of thing these debates should contain, right? And again, it's not just about the candidates. Every single person who's got a public megaphone that's large enough should include these numbers, exactly where they stand on them, as often as they can in every single interview. And if they don't, it's the interviewer's failure for not squeezing those numbers out of them. It's all about these numbers. Less isms, more numbers. To wrap that up, I'm going to... I'll link to the wiki article so you can read. There's much more to it. I'm just not going to... This is running too long. I don't want to make it into a really long video. There was a really annoying interview I listened to. It was Fareed Zakaria interviewing Jared Taylor. Now, Jared Taylor is genius in picking time after time people who interview him who just can't counter in just the most basic way his political agenda. So let's play a bit of this, because yeah, Fareed just fails all over this.
Saying the Japanese have to have a huge immigration policy that reduces them to minorities.
So let me ask you, you use the word replacement, and you've used it often.
Yeah.
What is your fear? What do you worry about?
Of disappearing, like this fellow that I debated with. He says, 200 years from now, no more white people. Should I want my people to disappear?
You remember at Charlottesville, there were people who were chanting, the Jews will...
Right there, that's not how you counter a concern like that. Like, just a show of hands, how many people think that that's a proper counter to a concern like that? The main counter to a concern like that is to the extent that he, Jared Taylor, keeps putting out videos titled, Why We Are Winning, to the extent that he is accurate, that there's this groundswell of support for his attitudes, let's call them, that this is very important to a growing number of people, then they will never disappear. To the extent that it's not even, there's no, aversive racism, most people don't even know what it is, let alone aversive racism being something that can be legally punished, financially penalized. There's nothing that's ever been proposed with a straight face that would outlaw something like aversive racism. Whites befriending fellow whites, whites marrying fellow whites, whites copulating with fellow whites. This will remain as legal as it's always been, and to the extent that he thinks he's got massive support, growing support, and all people need to do is expose themselves to his content, and it's just irresistible, then this entire project doesn't need to be politicized. All he needs to do is talk and not be censored, which he's not being censored, and increasingly whites will befriend fellow whites, marry fellow whites, copulate with fellow whites, and so whites will not disappear. Now, whether whites remain as large a share of the global population as they were historically 100 years ago, 200 years ago, whatever you think was the ideal period for whites as a percentage of the population, that's a totally different question, because he starts out talking about disappearance. You're not going to disappear. There's plenty of people, 7,400 comments in this video alone. Overwhelming majority of which say Jared Taylor mopped the floor with Fareed Zakaria. Right? So there's no shortage of whites who are very concerned with a future for white children. And that doesn't need to be, we don't need to do the whole ha Nazi meme type thing, right? We just need to point out that there's enough of them, and to the extent that there is enough of them, where does legality play into this? Right? The moment you show me an equivalent number of people, or even a fraction of the number of people supporting Jared Taylor who come out and unambiguously say, or even ambiguously say, whites marrying with whites, we're going to make that difficult for them. Right? They're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops, financially or in some other kind of ingenious way. No, there's nothing like that. The most Jared can conspiratorially reason his way that there's something like that going on is by pointing to mass immigration. But that, again, just ties into the idea that it's not so much about disappearance, it's just about becoming a smaller share of either the American population or the global population, which is less to do with heritage, ancestry, descendants, and just more to do with power plays and, dare I say it, population wars. So yes, point me to a policy or some sort of a nudge that all these people who are supporting Jared Taylor and all the people who are, let's say, nativists for quasi-ethnic reasons. Like, there's just millions of people in America alone who are on board with this. Point me to how they will be deterred from ensuring that there will be a future for white children. And that's how you counter this nonsense. All this is just apolitical advocacy that is being needlessly politicized. You know when you politicize it? Is when people want to outlaw whites copulating with whites. Okay, that's when you politicize this. But he wants to play he wants to pretend that he's playing defense, and that's why he needs to politicize it. And it's like there's a false consciousness attack going on against whites, trying to make them believe that it's irrelevant as to whether they have a future that contains fellow whites. So it echoes Marxist-style reasoning, that there's a culture industry that has brainwashed you from realizing what your true future-oriented interests are. Oh, right. It can't just be that people have sound reasons for not giving a shit. Fellow whites who may give a shit about that, and fellow whites who don't give a shit about that for sound reasons. No, that can't possibly be it, right? Just like you can't possibly both understand a doctrine like Marxism, understand it every bit as well and comprehensively as the world's most educated Marxists, and nonetheless reject it, right? See, that's almost inconceivable to, like, say, the average Marxist. The average Marxist believes is to be a non-Marxist is to misunderstand Marxism at some point down the line, right? That's false consciousness 101. It's delusional. It's culture, industry, talking point nonsense. There's a great many positions, right, that people are convinced others don't share with them simply because there's a breakdown in those other people's understandings. Like, one exception to the rule is enough to get you to start thinking that maybe it's a little more complex than that. Maybe I can understand every single sentence that Jared Taylor utters, me and many more, and nonetheless be completely unpersuaded that this is at all relevant, let alone the most relevant subject. That's his granddaddy project, is the future of whites. And that's fine, but don't tell me that if I don't value it one little bit, let alone prioritize it as the main thing, that I have been misled by a culture. I have been indoctrinated. It is essentially saying is to disagree with me is to misunderstand where I'm coming from. That's essentially it. But they don't have to put it in those plain terms. And when they're tap dancing around it, the role of the interviewer should be say it point blank. The only way a white person can take some issue with the priority you assign to this or with the fact that you hold the position in the first place is to misunderstand because your complex train of thought is just too damn complex for them, for their feeble little mainstream media infused brains. Have him say something like that and then take him to task.
Not replace us. Is that your fear? I mean, you could use any other term for Jews, Hispanics, blacks, whatever, Asians.
The point is...
So Fareed brought it to Charlottesville, Charlottesville.
A people being substituted for another people. That is what I oppose. I oppose that for my people as well as for any other people.
And that circles to immigration policy, even if you want to, from that angle of the population dynamics, so it matters what percent of the population, not disappearance, but it just matters what percent of the population whites are. If that's also important, which you have to demonstrate in the first place, but if you show that it is, then simply advocate for a particular immigration policy. The purity of a white separatist movement does not have to, you don't have to go that far. Just tinker with immigration, single policy. But he wants the whole section of America to be white-only, a white-only section, which is just overkill.
And that it is entirely profound.
Let alone utopian, and like, because we see just how much pearl clutching takes place when you just hammer the immigration subject, let alone the prospect of this actually being implemented in some way. It's like, no fucking way without World War III in American, like Civil War II, I guess I should say.
Moral to resist that kind of replacement.
Even though what you call replacement has really been the commingling, which has happened through most of these countries, as I'm saying, whether you look at France, which has had more people in from all parts of Europe, if you look at what has happened to the United States, if you look at what has happened to places like England, what you call replacement has also been a historical process of mingling that has happened forever.
If you're telling me that the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Norsemen, yes, they have mingled to some degree in the United Kingdom, and you're telling me...
And the French, don't forget the Norman invasion.
Okay, hold on. In that case, and you're telling me, well, if the Haitians or the Guatemalans or the Vietnamese, the Chinese come, it'll work out in exactly the same way.
So why won't it?
it will work out, but I don't think that anything that is uniquely British, distinctly British, will remain.
Well, what is British if it turns out that there are a whole bunch of Frenchmen and Jutes and Nordics and they, isn't it?
So let's understand also that uniquely British, I mean, people in a lot of these nations right now resemble each other more, all things considered, despite massive differences. They resemble each other far more than a British person from 2019 resembles a British person, the average British person from 1519. Like, especially when we go to pre-literacy, widespread, before literacy became widespread, epochs. I mean, get out of here.
Isn't it something you're kind of...
You really don't believe any population is distinct from another? You really believe that?
Well, I'm trying to...
They're very much distinct. They are distinct to an extent regionally right now, but when we talk about temporal distinctions spanning centuries, there's more distinctiveness taking place there, even though we've called it Britishness or what have you across all these different centuries.
And what population? Is it a racial category? Is it a religious category? You kind of
it can
jump,
right?
You choose whichever one you like.
It's an ideological category, first and foremost. And then you travel far back in time, massive ideological differences, because people didn't really have much of an ideology, because it was pre-literacy, but they were still Brits, to run with the British example.
As I pointed out, in scientific terms, I'm Aryan and Caucasian, but yet you don't regard me as white. And I'm not sure how you make these Southern Italians, for example, people came from Sicily, were generally regarded as close to being black, certainly not being white when they came to this country. Now, I'm presuming you regard them as your fellow white citizens.
Some of them have a North African admixture, it's true, and so do Portuguese. But yes.
And so they're ruled out?
No, they're not being ruled out. Look, you really are hung up on this idea.
I'm trying to understand. You want to make fairly substantial public policy on the basis of it. I want to know who's we and who's they.
Mr. Zakaria, public policy is already made on the basis of race all the time, and almost never.
Well, on the immigration subject, it really is made on economic desperation. So I guess he wants to spin it into there being this is something that is effectively a cultural Marxist plot, if I may use the trendy term of the day, is that there's insidious plotting. And it's not just the fact that people fleeing most frequently into white majority countries are non-white, because non-white majority countries tend to do more poorly economically than white majority countries. But we can't just call it for what it is, can't just call a spade, so we have to turn it into a plot, a displacement plot.
Is there any confusion as to what race someone is? Almost never. Why you?
I'm not advocating that. I've never been a particular advocate of those policies.
All right. All I'm saying is this is not nearly as complicated a matter as you suggest.
All right. Let me ask you another philosophical thing, which I think underlies this. Tell me if I'm wrong. Is that you don't think all races are equal? Right?
No, I do not, and I don't see why anyone would. Why would anyone think that Congo pygmies, on average, are as intelligent as Koreans? There's no evidence for that.
So when...
This is such a boring debate because it always ends up, there's a tiebreaker. So Fareed will talk about environmental factors dominating, Jared will talk about genetic factors dominating, but the current science has it that it's mostly interaction driven, and then it's like some between 40 and 80%. And if you think that it's not an open controversy, where on that spectrum, 40-80%, 40 to 80%, I consider you a dogmatist, because geneticists are saying it's an open controversy still, and more is being discovered.
Thomas Jefferson writes in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. You don't believe it?
He did not believe it. Did he think
I'm asking you what you believe.
Of course not. No human...
all people are entitled to equal amounts of dignity or equal consideration under the law. Jesus. See, this is just talking at cross purposes. I bet you minutes from now they're going to realize that they were meaning different things based on that quote. I mean, God, how much misunderstanding has that one single quote inspired? And how much wasted communicational energy? Because we don't have precise language. We have flowery language that we take too fucking seriously by people who have been dead for way too long, for whose words shouldn't carry much weight.
on earth thinks that every person is equal? They may be equal
So
before
you
the
don't
law.
believe the Declaration of Independence? I thought it was kind of, as an immigrant, I was told that's kind of important to being an American.
The Declaration of Independence had a particular purpose. It was to explain to the world why we were separating from England. H.L. Mencken has an interesting burlesque translation into English of the Declaration. And when he gets to that point, he translates it as, me and you are as good as the next guy, maybe better. These are American colonists explaining to King George, look, we are not intimidated by you. We are going our own way. And if you wish to interpret that clause as equal genetically, biologically,
Going their own way before going their own way became cool.
in talents, abilities, that is obvious foolishness. If you wish to interpret it equal before the law, then that's fine, and that has no particular significant meaning. Thomas Jefferson himself said the Declaration had served its purpose of parting ties with England. Other than that, it had no particular new or interesting or significant idea.
Yeah, I guess I thought I paused it before the history stuff, because the history stuff is just the most boring stuff you can possibly play. But I think I played enough of this to cover the entire. I mean, they had a 56-minute interview, and it was just I covered the core objection, to which there is no counter objection. Focus on a single policy. Don't start talking about building a brand new nation from scratch based on racial purity or something approximating racial purity. All right, I think I'm done. But yeah, counterpoints more than welcome if you got any.